On a cold March night in 1998, a 19-year-old college student named Suzanne Suzy Lyall stepped off a city bus near her dorm at the State University of New York at Albany and was never seen again. The walk from the Collins Circle stop to her dorm was short, well lit, familiar. But somewhere in that brief stretch of campus, Suzy vanished. The next morning, her family's world tilted. Her bed was untouched, her hair dryer still on the blanket, and her wallet, books, and money left behind. The only clue that would emerge came 2 months later. A work name tag lying in a parking lot 30 yards from where she'd last been spotted. Notice how small that distance is. A few steps, a few minutes, and a life disappeared. What no one knew at the time was that the search for Suzy Lyall would stretch across decades and still yield no answers. Suzanne Suzy Gloria Lyall was born on April 6, 1978, in Saratoga Springs, New York, the youngest of 3 children to Doug and Mary Lyall. Growing up in Ballston Spa, she was known as quiet and deeply thoughtful, a young woman who preferred calm over crowds and ideas over noise. From an early age, Suzy was drawn to technology. She could build a computer from scratch before most of her peers knew how to install a program. But she wasn't defined by logic alone. She was also a poet, filling pages with words that helped her navigate the world around her. Her father once said writing was how she worked through the challenges of daily life. Those close to her described someone with a gentle humor, patient empathy, and a love for learning that guided everything she did. After graduating high school with honors in 1996, Suzy pursued computer science, first at SUNY Wananta, then at SUNY Albany, dreaming of a career in tech before most people knew the word cyber. She balanced classes with 2 part-time jobs, including one at a software store in Crossgates Mall. Friends remember her as dependable and kind, the kind of person who quietly held others together. When Suzanne joined her high school computer club, she met its leader, a young man named Richard Condon. At first, he seemed like someone who shared her interests. A fellow enthusiast for technology, intelligent and ambitious, their connection grew naturally, and by the time Suzy left for college, the two had been dating for several years. To her family, Richard appeared polite, if somewhat private. He was part of Suzy's routine, someone she called or emailed almost every day. But beneath that familiarity, something was shifting. Friends and family would later describe their relationship as troubled, marked by emotional dependence and quiet tension. Suzy had reportedly tried to end things more than once, always through carefully written letters. Each time she was persuaded to return. Investigators would later learn that Richard knew personal details most wouldn't, like her bank PIN and how to access her computer remotely. At the time, these details seemed harmless, signs of trust between a young couple. But that would soon change. When Suzy vanished, those same details, her PIN, her access codes, became the focus of an investigation that would stretch for years, and a question that still lingers. How well do we ever truly know the people closest to us? In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Suzy had quietly mentioned something unsettling to a coworker at Babbage's, a man she believed was following her. She didn't appear frightened, just wary, unsure what to make of it. The identity of that man was never discovered. At the same time, those closest to her sensed a strain in her relationship with Richard. Her mother, Mary, recalled moments of control and manipulation, describing how Suzy would try to end the relationship only to be drawn back by Richard's pleas. Though they lived just 10 minutes apart, when Suzy went missing, he didn't visit her dorm or contact police. Still, authorities were hesitant to act. Campus security initially dismissed her parents' concern, saying that college students often left without notice. For days, critical hours slipped away. Snow fell over the area, possibly covering any traces that might have explained what happened between the bus stop and her dorm. It wasn't until Suzy missed classes and exams, something she'd never done before, that police finally began to investigate. By then, leads were faint and questions had multiplied. What no one knew at the time was that those early delays would haunt the case for decades. March 2nd, 1998, began like any other day for 19-year-old Suzanne Suzy Lyall. She woke early, preparing for her midterm exam, a test she'd been anxious about for days. Her manager later recalled that she seemed nervous, determined to do well enough to protect her near-perfect GPA. When the exam ended, Suzy believed she'd done reasonably well. That afternoon, she went to work at Babbage's, the small software store inside Crossgates Mall. Her co-workers remembered her as quiet that day, a little tired, but in good spirits. She clocked out after her shift, boarded her usual city bus, and disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of evening commuters. Notice how normal that moment seemed, how routine it all was. The same bus, the same stop, the same short walk she'd made dozens of times before. At approximately 9:45 p.m., another student saw Suzy step off at the Collins Circle bus stop on the SUNY Albany campus. It was just a few hundred feet from her dorm at Colonial Quad. She never made it there. When Suzy didn't check in that night, no email, no call, her boyfriend Richard noticed first. The next morning, he phoned her mother, asking if she'd heard from Suzy. Mary Lyall hadn't, and immediately sensed something was wrong. Suzy was reliable, predictable in the best possible way. She never disappeared without notice. Mary and her husband, Doug, contacted campus security, urging them to check their daughter's dorm room. Officers complied, though reluctantly. They found her belongings exactly as she'd left them. Money on the desk, her hairdryer still on the bed, books and clothes neatly arranged. Everything suggested she intended to return that night. Only Suzy was missing. At first, police dismissed the Lyalls' concerns. They told the family that college students often left campus unexpectedly. But Mary and Doug knew their daughter. She wasn't impulsive, and she wasn't the type to walk away from her commitments, or from her family. It wasn't until Suzy missed a midterm exam and her part-time job that campus police began to reconsider. By then, crucial time had already passed. In the days between her last sighting and the official start of the investigation, a snowstorm blanketed the area. Any physical traces that might have existed, footprints, dropped belongings, tire marks, were erased. Police expanded their search across campus, through wooded areas and near Rensselaer Lake. Nothing surfaced. Her ID card hadn't been used to access dorm buildings since the afternoon of March 2nd. It was as though she'd vanished between one breath and the next. Then came a discovery that deepened the mystery. Mary and Doug contacted their daughter's bank, asking whether any recent transactions had been made. There had been 3. 2 withdrawals of $20 each on March 2nd, amounts Suzy often took out for small expenses. But a third withdrawal appeared the next day, March 3rd, from an ATM at a Stewart's Shop's convenience store in Albany. Investigators were almost certain Suzy hadn't made that transaction herself. What no one knew at the time was that this $20 withdrawal would become one of the most confounding clues in her disappearance. Surveillance footage from the Stewarts showed a man wearing a baseball cap with a Nike logo, soon dubbed Nike Man by investigators, inside the store around the same time. Police tracked him down and questioned him, but found no link between him and Suzy. His presence, they concluded, was likely a coincidence. Still, the timing was difficult to ignore. Who else could have known Suzy's PIN? According to Richard, he and Suzy were the only 2 who did. Why he had that information was never explained. 2 months after Suzy vanished, another strange find surfaced. A worker discovered her old Babbage's name tag in a parking lot roughly 30 yards from the bus stop. It wasn't the tag she'd been using at the time. It was an older one. Investigators couldn't determine how long it had been there or how it got there. The spot where it was found was on the opposite side of the lot from her dorm, suggesting she may have walked, or been led, in the other direction. Notice how such a small detail, a plastic name badge, shifted the focus of the investigation. For months, it was the only tangible piece of evidence connected to Suzy's disappearance. Police combed through hundreds of tips, 270 in total. They searched approximately 300 acres of surrounding land, woods, and lake areas. No other sign of Suzy was ever found. As the search stretched on, rumors began to swirl. One co-worker came forward with a chilling claim. Suzy had mentioned being followed by an unknown man in the weeks before she went missing. She didn't seem frightened, only unsettled. Investigators were never able to identify who that man might have been, or if he had any connection to her disappearance. Attention soon turned to Richard. While police found no physical evidence implicating him, there were troubling details. Mary Lyall told investigators that her daughter had grown unhappy in the relationship, describing it as controlling and emotionally fraught. She had written Richard letters to end things several times, but each time he had convinced her to stay. Despite living only 10 minutes from campus, Richard didn't visit her dorm or alert authorities when she went missing. He later told police he'd been home playing an online game with a friend that night, a claim the friend confirmed. Even so, when investigators asked him to take a polygraph, Richard refused and quickly hired an attorney. He has never spoken to police about the case again. What no one knew at the time was that this silence would endure for decades. Richard would move away, marry, and begin a new life, never again discussing the young woman whose absence became one of New York's most enduring mysteries. Years later, new names would surface. In 2005, police identified a man named John Regan as a possible person of interest. Regan had been arrested for an attempted abduction of a female student in Saratoga Springs, not far from where Suzy grew up. He was also awaiting trial for a 1993 kidnapping in Connecticut. But Regan refused to talk about Suzy's case, and investigators found no evidence connecting him to her disappearance. Then, another possibility emerged, one that reached beyond Albany. Some began to suspect that Israel Keyes, a serial killer later linked to multiple murders across the U.S., might have been responsible. In 1998, Keyes lived in upstate New York and enlisted in the Army in Albany later that same year. His known methods, targeting strangers, demanding their ATM PINs, and using their cards after abductions, bore unsettling similarities to Suzy's case. Keyes was eventually captured in 2012, but before taking his own life in prison, he refused to reveal the identities of his victims. Among the missing persons on a list found on his computer was Suzy Lyall's name. Investigators have never confirmed any link between them, but the possibility remains one of the many haunting what-ifs that shadow her case. Through every lead, every name, one truth remained constant. No physical evidence, no confirmed sightings, and no closure. The distance between the bus stop and Suzy's dorm was less than a 5-minute walk. Yet in that brief span, she disappeared completely. What no one knew at the time, and what still confounds investigators today, is how someone could vanish so entirely, in so public a place, without leaving even a trace behind. In the days after Suzy's disappearance, the Lyall family's lives transformed into an endless cycle of waiting, searching, and pleading for answers. They handed out flyers, spoke with reporters, and organized searches across Albany. Each night brought a fragile hope that the phone might ring, that someone had seen her, or that she'd walk through the door. But the days turned to weeks, and the silence deepened. The snow that had first concealed potential evidence soon gave way to spring, revealing nothing new. By the time state police formally joined the investigation, the trail had gone cold. Investigators scoured Suzy's academic, financial, and digital records. They questioned her classmates, co-workers, and friends. Every possible lead seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. The lack of evidence made even the most basic questions unanswerable. Did she leave the bus stop willingly? Was she forced? Had someone she trusted betrayed her? When the ATM footage emerged, showing a man with a Nike hat near the machine where her card was used, it seemed for a moment like a turning point. But that, too, led nowhere. The man was located, questioned, and cleared. Police began to look harder at Richard Condon. His access to Suzy's PIN, his remote access to her computer, and his emotional influence over her all raised suspicions. To her mother, he remained the most likely person to know what had happened. Yet without physical evidence or a confession, the case could not advance. Richard's cooperation ended quickly. Once he retained an attorney, communication ceased. Investigators respected his right to silence but noted its timing. His alibi, playing an online game with a friend, was verified, and there was no sign of struggle, forced entry, or other evidence linking him to foul play. Still, detectives admitted privately that something about his behavior never sat right. When asked years later One investigator remarked that while Richard couldn't be conclusively tied to the crime, neither could he be ruled out. Over time, new theories replaced old ones. The 2005 arrest of John Regan reignited interest when investigators noticed the proximity of his crimes to Suzy's hometown. He had abducted a student near Saratoga Springs, a place Suzy knew well. But once again, the connection remained speculative. Regan refused to speak about Suzy, and searches of his home and vehicles revealed nothing linking him to her case. Then came Israel Keyes, a name that would send chills through law enforcement nationwide. His pattern of abductions, his familiarity with New York State, and his method of withdrawing small sums of money after taking victims prompted renewed attention. In his computer, authorities found a list of missing persons, including Suzy's name. But that detail, though haunting, proved nothing. Keyes took his secrets with him when he died in 2012. For Suzy's family, each passing year brought a painful mix of endurance and despair. They learned to live inside the waiting. Doug Lyall once said that grief without answers feels like a wound that never closes. The family continued to cooperate with investigators, attended vigils, and spoke at events to keep her name alive. Still, the uncertainty persisted, every lead eventually looping back to the same unanswered question: where is Suzy? In 2018, 2 decades after her disappearance, former lead investigator John Camp gave a rare public statement. "We believe it's a homicide," he said carefully. "Is there a chance she moved away? It's a possibility, but the reality is she's probably been a victim of a homicide." It was the closest the state police had come to acknowledging what the Lyalls had known in their hearts for years. By then, Doug and Mary Lyall had transformed their private heartbreak into public advocacy. They founded the Center for Hope, an organization that provides resources and emotional support for families of missing persons. In interviews, Mary spoke softly, with the steady tone of someone who had long since exhausted anger. "You can never get over it," she said. "There's always that hole in your heart. It'll never heal." Doug passed away in 2015, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Mary continues the search, working with volunteers, speaking at awareness events, and urging anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. As of today, no one has been charged, no remains have been found, and the case remains open. The official file reads simply, "Active investigation." What no one knew that night in March 1998 was that Suzanne Lyall's disappearance would outlast decades of technological change, new investigators, and countless theories. What endures is the absence, the space where her life should have continued, and the quiet determination of a family who refuses to let her be forgotten. The disappearance of Suzy Lyall did not fade quietly into history. It changed laws, reshaped policies, and inspired a legacy of hope born from unimaginable loss. In the years following her disappearance, Doug and Mary Lyall became relentless advocates, transforming their private grief into public purpose. They refused to let their daughter's case become another unsolved name in a file. Working with lawmakers, they pushed for change that would help other families avoid the same paralyzing delays they had endured. In 2003, their efforts culminated in the signing of Suzanne's Law by President George W. Bush. The law mandates that police immediately report missing persons between the ages of 18 and 21 to the National Crime Information Center, closing a devastating gap that had hindered early searches for young adults like Suzy. Before this legislation, law enforcement often treated those over 18 as voluntary runaways, causing precious hours and evidence to slip away. Suzanne's Law corrected that oversight, ensuring that no family would be told to simply wait a few days again. Notice how one family's heartbreak reshaped national policy, a legacy of prevention carved from pain. The Lyalls didn't stop there. They founded the Center for Hope, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and promoting public awareness about the complexities of such investigations. Through the center, they organized vigils, distributed information about cold cases, and built a network of empathy among those who understood the agony of uncertainty. Mary Lyall often spoke about how community gave her strength, explaining that while she still longed for closure, helping others gave meaning to her daughter's absence. Suzy's name also continues to echo across campuses in New York. Memorial scholarships and annual awareness events remind new generations of students that safety and vigilance are shared responsibilities. Each March, as the anniversary approaches, stories of Suzy's life, her curiosity, kindness, and quiet intelligence are retold not just as a mystery, but as a call to remember the person behind it. Friends describe her as someone who looked out for others, who built computers from scratch, who laughed softly and listened deeply. Keeping her story alive, they say, keeps that kindness alive too. In Albany, where she disappeared, students still pass the same bus stop at Collins Circle. Most never realize they're walking the same path where Suzy's life was interrupted. But for those who know, the spot holds a quiet gravity, a reminder of how swiftly the ordinary can become irreversible. The Lyall family's advocacy ensures that this awareness endures not as fear, but as vigilance and compassion. Though decades have passed, the case remains open. Investigators continue to review evidence, interview new witnesses, and apply modern forensic methods. Advances in digital forensics and DNA technology have revived cold cases far older than Suzy's, and her family still holds on to the hope that one day science or conscience will bring answers. Doug Lyall did not live to see that day. He passed away in 2015, leaving behind a legacy of determination and quiet courage. Mary carries that torch forward, speaking not just for her daughter, but for every missing person whose name risks being forgotten. In interviews, she often pauses before answering, as if choosing each word carefully, ensuring that her voice remains steady even as her heart carries the weight of years. "You never stop being a parent," she once said. "You just learn to live with the silence." The story of Suzanne Lyall is one of love persisting through absence, of a family's refusal to surrender to the unknown. It's about the difference one person can make, not just in life, but in how that life continues to shape the world long after it's gone. As the investigation continues, one truth endures: Suzanne. Suzy Lyall's light did not vanish that night in 1998. It transformed, guiding laws, inspiring action, and reminding everyone who hears her story that hope, once lit, is hard to extinguish.